Let's go into, are sweeteners healthy and are they safe to use? So first up, are they healthy? I think the title gives this one away anyway. They are called non-nutritive sweeteners. Therefore, they contain no nutrients. They offer zero net positive health outcomes. The only way you could frame that they are quote unquote healthy is if they pull you away from consuming products that are calorie dense. Hello, and I'm back with another episode of the Smart Strength Training Podcast. This is the podcast where I talk about popular trends and I look at it through an evidence-based lens. Today is podcast episode 18, and we've circled around the conversation of sweeteners. And are they useful for weight loss? Are they safe? And ultimately, are they healthy to have as part of your diet? If you spent any more than, say, 10 minutes online and you're interested in nutrition, which I assume you are if you're listening to this podcast, then I'm sure you've heard TikTok and Instagram influencers talking about probably sweeteners and seed oils. Those two topics have really dominated the discussions for the last 18 months on social media when it comes to nutrition. So sweeteners are something people have concerns about, certainly health concerns about. However, in the weight loss space, swapping from a high sugar product to a product containing a sweetener to lower calories is very common. And of course, if you have these concerns around their health implications, then it can be a little bit of a concern. So first up, just in case you've been living under a rock and you're not sure what sweeteners are. So sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners are substances that are used to sweeten food. And because they are so much sweeter than normal sugar, sucrose, they can be used in smaller doses. And I'm sure you've heard of a few of the kind of like common sweeteners: aspartame, saccharin, sucralose, and stevia. There are others, but they're the probably main four that you might have heard of, that you will have heard of. And last year, 2023, sweeteners were reclassified to category 2B as a possible carcinogen. So this topic has absolutely blown up online. But before we go there, let's talk about sweeteners and weight loss. And ultimately, are sweeteners useful for weight loss? Because something you'll hear, any influencer that is sort of trying to scare you off sweeteners will say that sweeteners will spike your blood glucose, but because there's no actual glucose present, this will mean that you're having elevated insulin, and because insulin is a storage hormone, if it's elevated, you will store more fat. So couple of things I want to make sure that you understand from those statements. So first up, do sweeteners spike your blood glucose levels and therefore increase your insulin levels as well? So research very consistently shows that sweeteners have minimal to no effect on blood glucose. Sucralose is the only one that has probably slightly more mixed research. Still, the majority of that research shows pretty minimal effects, but some research has shown that there is a effect to insulin sensitivity and glucose metabolism, and that would seem to be more so in people that just aren't accustomed to drinking anything with a sweetener in. So people that just don't drink those sorts of beverages regularly, because that research was done on beverages. So overall, I think it's fairly safe to say that if you're having sweeteners or a product containing sweeteners, it's not going to negatively affect your blood glucose, and there's going to be no insulin spike. But that leads nicely into this next part of the conversation. That does insulin stop you from being able to lose weight? Because there's a lot of confusion on the topic, and ultimately confusion centers around that insulin does have an acute response on how we utilize and can access fuel effectively. So when insulin is elevated, more glucose is stored as glycogen in the liver and in the muscles, which is actually a good thing. But also excess glucose is more likely to be converted into fat, because high insulin levels stimulate lipogenesis, which is the storage of fat, and inhibits lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat. All sounds quite scary as a single mechanism, as a standalone action. But what happens when you put this up to tests? Because let's say if insulin did completely inhibit weight loss, that would mean that any high carb diet would fail. But we see from the research, there's a lot of research into high carb versus low carb diets, that we see weight loss in both groups. So how then can insulin totally block our ability to lose weight? And the reality is, these short-term acute responses directly after consumption of sugar, obviously we've got multiple hours of a day, they don't play out in the long term. And when you do look at research that actually spikes insulin directly before a meal, but when those research papers are controlling calories, we still see that insulin spiking pre-meal doesn't actually negatively affect someone's ability to lose weight. I think the real key word when we talk about insulin is the word constantly. So if you constantly elevate your blood glucose and therefore have constantly elevated insulin, that's a big difference to just a single or more sporadic insulin spikes based on the fact that you only consume those sorts of things every now and then. But years of overconsumption of highly processed, refined foods, probably eating in a caloric surplus, so you're gaining weight, paired with the fact that someone's inactive, is likely going to lead to insulin resistance, and that definitely will make weight loss more challenging. That does not mean that the occasional blood glucose spike and therefore insulin spike is going to trash your ability to lose weight. And we have to recognize within nutrition, it's so common at the moment to find these isolated mechanisms and then just expand across the entire topic and say, because of this, that proves that you can't, in this context, lose weight. And that is not the case. We have to look at the longitudinal research, and the longitudinal research shows that it is possible to lose weight when insulin is elevated. Okay, so can then sweeteners promote weight loss? Because this is a more confusing topic. If you look at the research into populations of people that consume the highest amount or a higher amount of sweeteners, you are much more likely to find these populations are obese and overweight. But you could argue that these populations are probably less health conscious as a whole and more likely to be inactive. And then when you look at research where they just swap out sugary beverages for their low sweetener or their low sugar or no sugar sweetened counterparts, then you'll often see that body weight management is improved when consuming sweeteners. There's actually some research that shows that weight loss was seen to be better in a group consuming sweeteners than that consuming water. It's just a single study, but it's just to show, like, a lot of the times that these research spaces can be a little bit cluttered. So let's go and look at both sides of this argument. So the evidence supporting that sweeteners are good for weight loss. So the first of it is obvious, it's caloric reduction. If I'm simply swapping out a sugary, highly calorie dense beverage or yogurt for a sweetened, low to no calorie counterpart, I'm going to be reducing my total caloric intake. As I've touched on, by doing so, you're going to have better glycemic control. You're not going to have elevated blood glucose. What I would say about elevated blood glucose is potentially you have better energy because of it, and you may be able to manage food hunger and cravings slightly better, which leads nicely into this next one, which is for sort of craving and appetite regulation can be better if you are not consuming sugary foods and swapping to sweetened foods. But let's then go into the evidence against sweeteners. So the big one probably is that you might compensate. Some studies show that people that compensate by having these low calorie sweetened alternatives will then start to eat other foods because they've had the low calorie version. There is, which I won't go into detail on this podcast, but there's a conversation around the metabolic effect. Some evidence shows that sweeteners can affect our gut microbiome, and that could affect how we metabolize food. This is it's not necessarily a new area of research, but it's certainly an area that's not fully understood. And the last one is more sort of psychological factors around sweetened foods, because even if you are going to sweetened foods or sweetened beverages and you're getting that sweet sense on your tongue, it makes you more dependent or more desire more sweet food. So for some people, it can blunt cravings for sweeteners, but for some other people, it can do the complete opposite. So if you're the sort of person that you find that swapping them out from a high sugar to a sweetened product is good, then that's great. But also recognize that the opposite can be true. And I think this is the problem with a lot of this. Like people online, we all love anecdote, we all love to give personal insight. But what you experience yourself isn't probably exactly the same as somebody else, which is why we do need to look at the research into these topics. So let's go into, are sweeteners healthy and are they safe to use? So first up, are they healthy? I think the title gives this one away anyway. They are called non-nutritive sweeteners. Therefore, they contain no nutrients. They offer zero net positive health outcomes. The only way you could frame that they are quote unquote healthy is if they pull you away from consuming products that are calorie dense. As for their safety, sweeteners have been classified as this class 2B carcinogen, but I think it's also worth stating that in that category is aloe vera, certain herbal remedies, I always say this one wrong, ginkgo biloba, however it's said, the use of your mobile phone, and pickled vegetables. So that's probably trying to downplay a little bit. Lead is also in there, so too is exhaust fumes. But just recognizing this classification doesn't instantly mean that you have to be terrified. And that's what I guess is a little bit frustrating when you see it portrayed online, because they still have the place they can be useful for some people. And I think it's important when we talk about safety of anything, because recognizing there is a toxic dose to water, there's a toxic dose to omega-3 fatty acids. So knowing that the dose makes the poison is really important. And if you look at the current safety standards in the UK, you would need to consume more than 24 cans of Diet Coke or Coke Zero per day to exceed those limits. And if you looked at the limits in America, so the safety standards in America, I believe that's close to 30. So you would have to be consuming a large amount of these products for it to be unsafe. But circling back to what I just said, like there's no health benefits to consuming them. So to summarize, if swapping from a high sugar product to a sweetened alternative is a sensible way to reduce your total energy intake, I think that's a really smart thing to do. If you find, though, that you are doing that on lots and lots of foods over the course of a day, you may want to address the fact that you are leaning towards more sweet cravings and sugary foods overall. So as much as it might help in the short term, potentially long term, it's not going to be a great solution for you. Products containing sweeteners are safe to use, but again, remember they have no nutritional benefit to them. And if you are inquisitive at all, you'll notice that they are in quite a few things. So you can be trying to, because I've spoken to quite a few people that try to eliminate them. And if you're trying to eliminate them, they can be very, very hard to eliminate because they are in quite a few products. But I think we can recognize that they are safe to use. Most people aren't going to be going over that safety dosage. But you don't need to micromanage your diet and try and get out all sweeteners from your diet. Of course, I always urge people to eat a diet that's primarily composed of whole food, close to its original source, minimally processed, of course. But like lots of things, we need to find that balance where there is definitely place to have these foods, especially if it helps reduce total energy intake. And finally, just sort of circle back to something I said earlier, you do not need to worry about glucose spikes when it comes to weight loss overall. So sweetened beverages are fine. The occasional can of Coke that's just the full sugar version is also fine. That kind of wonderful everything in moderation. So I hope you found this episode useful. I do always love to hear your insight into these topics. I know lots of people have different experiences using things like beverages containing sweeteners. So if you've had a positive or negative result from using sweeteners, get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.